The night sky over St. Landry Parish in Louisiana, 1856, was heavy with heat. The cane fields, dry and brittle, hissed quietly in the breeze. Inside the grand plantation house, the master's family dined by candlelight, their table glittering with china and silver polished by hands that would never eat from them. Outside, the enslaved prepared for another endless night, some tending fires, others rocking children to sleep, all carrying silence like a second skin. But then came the blaze. It began small, perhaps just a spark hidden beneath a stack of cane stalks in the barn. But the wind carried it, hungry flames stretching upward, devouring wood, swallowing shadows. Within minutes, the fire leapt from barn to quarters, then from quarters to the house itself. The glow lit the swamp like a second sun, and the air filled with screams, not the daily cries of the lash, but something sharper, final, consuming. According to one surviving militia log written in the stiff hand of a parish captain, the Negro family, being charged with conspiracy, did willfully ignite the premises of their master's estate. Great loss of life ensued. The language is cold, distant. Great loss of life hides behind its formality the truth. Men, women, and children burned alive, suffocated by smoke, trapped by collapsing timber. Neighbors rushed to the scene, some with buckets of water, others with muskets. But by the time they arrived, the house was collapsing in on itself, its white columns glowing red against the night. Witnesses recalled the sound of beams splitting, glass shattering, voices screaming until they were gone. And at the center of it all, an enslaved family accused of striking the match. Their names are missing from most records, scratched out, erased, replaced with phrases like Negro family of 4. But fragments remain. One probate inventory from the year before lists them: a woman age 34, a man 36, 2 children, female age 12, and male age 10. Nothing more. Numbers on paper. Flesh and blood in life. Suspects in death. What drove them to fire? Was it madness? Was it rage? Or was it the only way left to survive in a world where their voices had been chained and their lives reduced to ledger lines? The press, when it spoke of the incident at all, called it an unfortunate conflagration. Some papers in New Orleans went further, blaming Negro savagery, and warning that leniency toward slaves bred insolence. But none spoke of the family's pain. None asked what they endured before the fire. None recorded the years of hunger, the whippings, the silence. Instead, silence became the verdict. The family, captured by militia within days, was lynched in public, their bodies displayed as warning. The records of their trial, if such a trial ever truly occurred, disappeared in the courthouse fire of 1862. What remains is absence. Absence where names should be, silence where testimony should speak, ash where history should remember. And yet, in that silence, the story whispers still. Descendant folklore from Louisiana carries fragments. The night the house burned, the night the fire walked. Grandmothers told children never to linger near the cane fields after dark, for the smoke carried spirits. Songs hummed in quarters decades later warned, when the hymn turns sharp, beware the flame. It is in these whispers, not the official archives, that the truth lives. The Louisiana Massacre of 1856 was not a random accident. It was resistance, brutal and final, carried out by a family who had been denied every other means of survival. Tonight, we drag their story back into the light. Not to romanticize, not to sanitize, but to confront. To expose what the system tried to bury, to give voice to those whose voices were torn from them. To ask the question that still echoes: was this madness or was this justice? And to you watching, this story is not just history. It is memory. It may live in your blood, in your family's whispers, in the names scratched out of an old Bible. If you have ever heard fragments of nights never spoken, if you have seen silence carried down generations, tell it below. Share it. Because every comment, every word, resurrects another record that history tried to erase. This is the opening file of a case buried in ash and silence. Stay with us because what follows is darker still. To understand the fire that consumed the plantation in 1856, we must first step into the world that built it, a world erected on human bondage, measured in acres and blood, wealth and silence. The Louisiana landscape in the mid-19th century was not only fertile ground for sugarcane but for cruelty refined into daily ritual. The plantation in question stretched across hundreds of acres, its borders marked by swamps and bayous that shimmered like mirrors under the southern sun. Sugarcane was the crop that defined it, tall stalks that sliced skin when handled carelessly, a plant that demanded endless labor and gave nothing back but profit to those who claimed ownership of the land. Sugar was wealth in Louisiana. In 1850, state census records show plantations producing millions of pounds each year, shipped northward and across the Atlantic. To the masters, the land was golden. To the enslaved, it was a prison without walls. The master's wealth was meticulously recorded in probate ledgers. A document from 1854 lists his assets: 56 head of cattle, 9 horses, 2 wagons, and, beneath livestock, 63 enslaved people valued at nearly $40,000. They were tallied as property, listed not by name but by category: man, prime; woman, breeding; child, 8 years. Flesh became number, number became value, value became legacy. The house itself was a monument to that conversion of pain into wealth. Built in Greek Revival style, it loomed over the fields with tall white columns and wide verandas. Travelers described such homes as symbols of refinement, but every brick, every plank of polished wood was laid by enslaved hands. Inside, chandeliers dripped with crystal, silverware glinted on linen, and portraits of ancestors stared down from walls as if approving the empire sustained by chains. The contrast between the master's house and the slave quarters was staggering. The quarters sat at the edge of the cane rows, crude cabins built of rough wood, their roofs leaking in rain, their floors packed dirt. Families of 6 or more crammed into single-room huts, sleeping on straw pallets, their air thick with smoke from hearths used for both cooking and warmth. Hunger was constant. Enslaved rations typically included cornmeal, molasses, and occasionally salted pork. Fresh vegetables and meat were luxuries often denied. Malnutrition weakened bodies already strained by endless labor. The geography of the plantation reinforced control. The main house overlooked the fields, its windows offering the master a constant view of those bent beneath the sun. Patrol posts dotted the periphery, where armed white men guarded against escape. The swamps themselves acted as natural barriers, treacherous, filled with snakes and mosquitoes, ready to swallow anyone who fled. Freedom was a horizon always visible yet impossibly far. Labor was brutal, relentless. The sugarcane harvest required dawn-to-dusk toil, cutting stalks with machetes, hauling bundles to mills where juice was boiled down into crystals. Overseers, often poor whites employed by the master, carried whips and pistols, their diaries cold with precision. One entry from a nearby plantation in 1855 reads, 5 lashes for lateness, 10 for spillage, 20 for insolence. The Negroes worked until midnight, finished the boiling. The whips cracked not just to punish but to remind. Silence and obedience were mandatory, enforced with every stripe of leather across skin. Children were not spared. By the age of 10, they were expected to work in fields or carry water to those who did. Their backs bent under loads too heavy, their small hands calloused from tools. They learned early that their lives were not their own, that their bodies belonged to someone else, that even laughter could be punished if it interrupted labor. Religion was twisted into another tool of control. Every Sunday the enslaved were marched into church, where sermons emphasized obedience. "Servants, obey your masters," was read aloud, a verse repeated until it lodged in memory like a shackle on the mind. But the enslaved reinterpreted these scriptures in private, whispering of Moses and deliverance, turning the master's Bible into a hidden promise of freedom. The plantation's economy thrived on this cruelty. In the mid-1850s, Louisiana planters were among the richest men in America. Their fortunes rivaled northern industrialists, their exports feeding factories and refineries across the globe. And yet, the wealth that bought fine silks and Parisian furniture was built on the backs of the starving. The boy and girl from the family accused of fire were likely listed as increase, the coldest word in plantation ledgers, meaning the children born into slavery, new assets added to the master's estate. This was the world the family knew. A world where their worth was measured in dollars, where their marriages were not recognized by law, where their children could be sold at a moment's notice. A world where silence was enforced and defiance was death. And yet, in the shadows of that world, humanity endured. Mothers hummed lullabies in languages long forbidden. Fathers carved charms of bone or wood, talismans against despair. Children played in dirt yards, inventing games that momentarily pushed back the weight of their chains. In these moments, they reminded themselves and each other that they were more than property, more than numbers, more than tools of profit. But the plantation was also a crucible, forging anger as much as survival. Every lash witnessed, every sale endured, every hunger pang pressed deeper into the soul. The boy, the girl, their parents, they carried not just wounds but memory. And memory over years became rage. The house that glittered with chandeliers in 1856 was not simply a home. It was a monument to theft, of bodies, of families, of futures. The fields that stretched endlessly were not just crops. They were chains planted in soil. The overseer's whip was not just discipline. It was war. And in such a world, fire became more than destruction. It became language. It became testimony. Because when every word was silenced, when every cry was ignored, when every plea was erased from ledgers, only flames could speak. And in 1856, one family recorded in probate as property, erased in trial as criminals, chose fire as their final word. When we look for the family at the heart of the Louisiana Fire of 1856, we do not find them in biographies or journals. We do not find them in carefully preserved letters, or in obituaries written with reverence. Instead, we find them in ledgers, cold, economic, bloodless. Their lives were not recorded as stories but as property entries. And yet, if we read these scraps carefully, if we search in the margins, their humanity begins to bleed through. A probate inventory from 1854, 2 years before the blaze, lists Negro woman, age 34, man, 36, girl, 12, boy, 10. No names. No kinship. No acknowledgement of love or marriage. Just a family reduced to numbers as interchangeable as cattle. But there they are, the fragments of the family accused of burning the plantation. We can trace them further back. Bills of sale from 1837 record a young woman purchased for $600. She appears in parish baptism rolls 2 years later, noted as Negro female baptized without surname. By 1844 she surfaces again in an estate transfer, woman with child. The child is not named, only valued. Her life, her motherhood, her very body reduced to increase. The cold accounting term for new slaves born into bondage. The father appears fleetingly. A ledger from 1848 notes, hired out for labor $120 per annum. He is treated not as a husband or father, but as an asset temporarily leased, like a mule. Did he spend seasons away from his family, hired to dig canals or fell timber for another master? Likely. His absence, marked only by dollars, must have scarred the family left behind in the quarters. The children, too, emerge in fragments. A baptism entry from 1846 lists female child of Negro woman, perhaps the daughter who, 10 years later, would be accused of carrying fire to the cane barn. A notation in 1848, male child, 2 years. Perhaps her younger brother, later described as age 10, in the 1854 inventory. To the clerks, they were nothing but anonymous children in a book of transactions. To their mother, they were her world. Yet even in these cold documents, humanity resists erasure. One overseer's notes, buried in parish archives, mention the girl by a description, bright-eyed, quick to speak, too bold. Another note warns, boy runs often, cannot be trusted to stay. These brief glimpses crack the ledger's silence. They remind us that these were not just assets but children with voices, tempers, wills. Children growing up under the lash, learning early that silence was survival, but daring sometimes to defy. Marriage, of course, was not recognized by law. The parents could not sign contracts, could not declare their union before a court. And yet, enslaved couples created bonds nonetheless. They jumped brooms, they whispered vows, they carved love out of a system designed to tear it apart. The ledgers never mention these unions, but descendant folklore remembers them. One oral account, collected a century later, tells of a man and woman on the bayou who swore before God they would die together before they bent again. The story fits too closely to be coincidence. We also see erasure in the omissions. The 1856 parish census lists enslaved numbers by age, but the family at the center of the fire is absent. Deliberately? Perhaps. After the blaze, their names may have been struck out, their memory scrubbed from official rolls. But absence itself is evidence. When a family vanishes from ledgers after a catastrophe, their silence screams. To reconstruct them, then, we must read across archives. Bills of sale, baptism registers, overseer diaries, fragments of probate. Together they sketch a family denied names, denied humanity, yet bound by blood and love. The mother, purchased young, aged into a woman of resilience. The father, hired out, present in fragments. The daughter, bold and quick-tongued. The son, restless, already testing the boundaries of chains. This family was not unique. Across Louisiana, enslaved families existed in this fractured way, their lives scattered across documents, their bloodlines broken by sale, their names reduced to whispers. But in 1856, this family became singular, remembered not for their ledger lines but for their act. They are remembered because they set the fire that the masters tried to erase. And this is the cruel paradox. Without the blaze, their names might have been lost entirely, buried under numbers in probate books. It was only by burning the house that they carved their way into history. By destroying, they preserved. By erasing the master's wealth, they preserved their own memory. The ledgers tell us they were numbers. The fire tells us they were people. And when we hold these together, the documents of erasure and the act of defiance, we begin to understand their humanity. They were not demons, not monsters, not savages as the newspapers would later claim. They were a family. A mother who sang lullabies in the quarters. A father who carved charms of wood. A daughter who spoke too boldly. A son who ran too often. A family who refused in the end to live forever in the margins of ledgers. Their names may never be found. Their faces may never appear in portraits. But their existence is undeniable, written in ledgers that sought to erase them, written in fire that forced history to remember. This was the family in the ledger. And in 1856 they chose to write themselves out of it, with flames. The fire of 1856 did not erupt from nowhere. It was born of years lived under the yoke, of survival stretched so thin it became silence, of silence pressed so hard it became rage. To understand why a family would set torch to the plantation that held them captive, we must enter their daily world, not the ledgers that counted them as property, but the lived reality of their flesh, their hunger, their exhaustion, their muted prayers. Every morning began before the sun. A horn sounded, dragging men, women, and children from straw pallets in shacks barely fit for animals. They filed into the cane fields as the sky blushed with dawn, their bodies still aching from the day before. Sugar cane is not gentle work. Its stalks are heavy, its leaves razor-sharp, its harvest relentless. They cut with machetes until hands blistered, hauled bundles until backs bent, loaded carts until legs trembled. Overseers carried whips, pistols, and ledgers, tracking not just output but obedience. Meals were brief, rationed, and cruelly meager. Cornmeal stirred with water into mush. Molasses ladled sparingly. Salt pork when the master deemed it. Malnutrition was constant, leaving bellies distended, eyes hollow, skin thin. The children of the family accused of fire would have grown up with hunger as their first memory, not the playful hunger of missed snacks, but the bone-deep ache that never ended. Punishment was daily ritual. Overseer diaries from nearby plantations are chilling in their routine. 10 lashes for insolence, 5 for slowness, 30 for theft of corn. Each crack of the whip carved not only skin but silence. Those who cried too loud risked worse. Those who resisted risked death. Pain became a language all its own, one spoken fluently by everybody in the quarters. And yet, survival demanded more than silence. It demanded ingenuity. Enslaved men and women carved hidden strategies into their days. They broke tools deliberately, buying a moment's rest. They feigned illness to protect their children from the lash. They passed stolen food in the shadows, risking punishment so that others could eat. These small acts of defiance rarely made the records, but they were the quiet heartbeat of survival. Silence, too, was weaponized. Children learned early not to speak of what they saw. Not the master slipping into cabins at night. Not the cries of women taken against their will. Not the men shackled and marched away, never to return. Silence became shield. To survive, you pretended not to notice. You stored memory deep inside, waiting, perhaps, for the day it might burn its way out. Religion became another survival tool, and another battlefield. On Sundays, the enslaved were herded into pews, forced to listen to sermons about obedience. Pastors, often paid by planters, quoted verses on submission. Servants, obey your masters. But in the quarters at night, another gospel took root. The enslaved reinterpreted scripture, finding hope in Exodus, imagining themselves as Israel awaiting deliverance. Songs rose from their throats, songs that sounded like hymns but carried double meanings. Steal away to Jesus was not just prayer but coded instruction. Steal away, flee, resist. The accused family would have known these songs. The daughter, quick-tongued, may have sung them under her breath while working the fields. The son, restless, may have tapped rhythms on wood, carrying the codes without knowing their full meaning. Their parents would have whispered the stories, of Moses, of deliverance, of a God who did not bless chains. Folklore lived in their nights as well. Tales of Br Rabbit, the trickster, circulated in the quarters, teaching children that cunning could defeat power, that even the smallest could outwit the strongest. The daughter may have grown up laughing at those tales, carrying them like secret maps in her mind. But as she grew older, laughter turned sharp. She realized that trickster tales were not just entertainment. They were instruction manuals for survival under the yoke. The physical toll was immense. Sugarcane harvest was one of the most grueling labors in the South. Mills boiled juice into crystals, filling the air with scalding steam. Burns were common, accidents frequent. Overseers recorded them clinically. Negro boys scalded, unable to work, loss for 3 weeks. Loss for them. Pain for him. To the masters, every body was an investment. To the enslaved, every scar was a reminder that life itself was cheap in the eyes of their owners. And yet, even in this brutality, community persisted. Families huddled together at night, sharing scraps of food, trading whispered stories, soothing children with songs. Women braided hair in patterns that carried hidden meanings, maps of escape woven into scalp. Men carved flutes or pipes, coaxing music from scraps of bone and reed. Against all odds, they built lives within cages, proving again and again that humanity could not be extinguished. But survival under the yoke came at a cost. It meant swallowing grief daily, living with constant loss. It meant watching neighbors sold, watching children vanish into the auction block's maw. It meant carrying memory of pain too deep to speak. And sometimes silence was no longer enough. The family accused of fire carried this silence like all others. They worked the cane, endured the lash, bowed their heads in sermons. But within them burned what silence could not extinguish. A mother who had seen her body treated as property. A father hired out, separated, denied dignity. A daughter bold enough to speak when silence was demanded. A son restless, already challenging chains. They survived day after day, but survival hardened into something else. Because when survival is reduced to silence, silence eventually becomes unbearable. And when silence breaks, it does not break gently. It erupts. It consumes. In 1856, on a hot Louisiana night, silence broke in fire. Every rebellion has its spark. It might smolder quietly for years, hidden beneath silence and obedience, until one act of cruelty tips the balance, until one wound becomes unbearable. For the family accused of setting fire to the plantation in 1856, the breaking point was not a single blow but a culmination, years of lashings, of hunger, of stolen dignity, condensed into one moment where fire became their only answer. The archives do not speak openly of this moment. Court records are missing. Overseer diaries fall silent in 1856. But fragments and whispers remain. In one parish report, scribbled hastily in the margins, a chilling note survives. The woman refused command. Severe discipline enacted in presence of children. The language is cold, stripped of humanity, but its meaning is unmistakable. A mother whipped before her children. A punishment meant not only for her flesh but for their spirits, to teach silence, to teach fear. Folklore collected decades later tells a sharper story. A daughter, 12 years old, assaulted by the master, her cries ignored, her protest punished. Her mother, in fury, resisting. Her father, beaten for trying to intervene. And the children watching, their world collapsing into grief and rage. We cannot prove every detail. Folklore reshapes truth, but the consistency of the whispers suggests something profound. A wound too deep for silence. The son, restless by nature, had already been noted as unreliable. One overseer's diary from 1855 describes him as prone to flight, requires constant vigilance. Perhaps he had tried to run before. Perhaps he dreamed of freedom in the swamps. But in 1856, escape was no longer enough. The daughter, once bold with words, may have been silenced by trauma, her fire turned inward. The parents, broken by years of labor, now carried grief heavier than chains. Together, their pain fused into resolve. There is evidence, too, of unrest across the region. Newspapers from nearby parishes mention increased insolence among the enslaved, suspicions of plotting. One overseer's note warns, the Negroes grow restless. Talk circulates after nightfall. Watch them closely. Fear was already in the air. Planters sensed rebellion without knowing where it would strike. The Louisiana Massacre of 1856 did not erupt in isolation. It was part of a larger tremor shaking the foundations of slavery. The breaking point was not only personal, it was structural. Sugar harvest in the mid-1850s was brutal beyond measure, requiring round-the-clock labor in mills where fires roared and steam hissed. Accidents were frequent, deaths common. An 1855 agricultural report notes, loss of 2 Negroes in boiling house explosion. Replaced by purchase. To the masters, lives were replaceable. To the enslaved, each death was another reminder that they were seen as expendable, their suffering measured only in profit. Imagine the family in those weeks before the fire. The mother's back raw from lashes. The daughter carrying silent trauma. The son restless, angry, whispering plans to friends in the quarters. The father, weary, knowing punishment could come again at any moment. Their small shack offered no refuge. Their nights were filled with hunger, their days with endless labor, their memories with grief. In such a world, silence becomes unbearable. One rumor, preserved in abolitionist papers, claims the family was overheard praying in strange tones the night before the blaze. Not the sanctioned prayers of Sunday sermons, but something darker, rawer. Invocations of deliverance, promises of justice. Perhaps they believed God would forgive them. Perhaps they no longer cared. Perhaps fire itself became their prayer, their psalm, their last testimony. Folklore adds one final image. Descendants recalled whispers of the daughter carrying a clay pot filled with embers from the quarters to the barn, her hands trembling but steady. Her brother shielding her, their parents watching in silence. Was this truth or legend? We cannot know. But the image lingers because it feels inevitable. Children forced to grow into fire bearers, parents forced to witness, all bound together in an act that turned their pain into flame. The breaking point then was not madness. It was logic forged in cruelty. If they remained silent, they would continue to suffer. If they resisted openly, they would be crushed. Fire offered something different. Fire erased the house that symbolized their chains. Fire leveled the wealth that had been built upon their backs. Fire silenced the master in a way no whip could silence them. In one abolitionist account printed years later, a writer noted, the act was no mere crime. It was judgment. The flames preached where sermons had lied. That is the essence of the breaking point. The enslaved family had been denied words, denied justice, denied humanity. Fire became their sermon. Fire became their trial. Fire became their voice. And so, on that night in 1856, the breaking point arrived. A moment when silence could not endure, when survival was no longer enough, when one family chose to turn the tools of the plantation, cane, timber, fire, against the system itself. Their act was not sudden. It was not impulsive. It was the inevitable culmination of years lived under the yoke, years of grief compressed into rage, years of silence pressed into flame. And when the fire rose, it carried not just smoke and ash, but testimony. Testimony that slavery could break bodies but not extinguish defiance. Testimony that even in the darkest quarters, sparks waited ready to ignite. The breaking point is the line where survival ends and resistance begins. In 1856, in a Louisiana parish, one family crossed that line. And history, though it tried to erase them, still carries the echo of their fire. The night of the fire was like any other in the parish, humid air heavy with the smell of cane, mosquitoes whining in the dark, overseers posted at the edges of the fields to remind the enslaved that even after dusk, chains remained. But inside the quarters, silence was broken. Somewhere between whispered prayers and clenched fists, the decision had been made. The plantation that had broken them would burn. It began with embers. A clay pot carried from a cabin hearth, cradled like a secret. Embers, glowing red, hidden beneath rags. The daughter, only 12, is said in folklore to have held it in her small hands, trembling but steady. Her brother shielded her as they crossed the dirt yard. Their parents followed close, their faces set, their silence unshakable. The act was not spoken aloud. It did not need words. They chose the barn. Stalks of dried cane were stacked high, brittle, ready for grinding. One spark was enough. The embers touched the straw, smoke curled upward, and within moments the barn was a torch, flames leaping greedily, devouring everything they touched. The wind carried the fire forward, spreading it from barn to cane rows, from cane rows to the main house itself. Witnesses later described the house glowing like a lantern in the swamp, its white columns painted red by flame. The windows shattered, the roof collapsed inward, sparks spraying into the night sky. Screams carried across the parish. Screams of the master's family trapped inside, screams of overseers running to fight the blaze, screams of enslaved men and women caught between terror and awe. Some accounts claim the family tried to flee in the chaos. Others suggest they stood still, watching the fire consume what had consumed them. One militia officer later wrote, "The Negro family showed no attempt at escape, but bore the scene with unnatural calm." Was it calm or was it relief? We cannot know. But we can imagine the moment. The crackle of fire louder than the crack of a whip, the master's cries drowned by the roar of flames, the plantation's power collapsing in ash. The fire did not spare lives. Reports, vague, deliberately softened, speak of loss considerable. Behind those words lies truth. The master's wife and children, overseers, perhaps even enslaved caught in the wrong place, all consumed. In total, oral tradition remembers at least a dozen dead. Newspapers, eager to sanitize, called it conflagration. They did not write of screams. They did not write of vengeance. But the enslaved remembered. For them, the fire was not only destruction. It was revelation. For one night, the master's power was stripped bare. His wealth, his house, his order, all reduced to smoke. The system told them they were powerless. The fire told them otherwise. Militia records hint at panic. All hands summoned, one captain scribbled. Negro quarters searched, suspected families seized. The accused were dragged from the ruins, beaten, shackled. But still the fire raged, unstoppable, consuming until nothing remained but charred beams and glowing ash. And here is where history falters. The official record blurs. Some say the family confessed under torture. Others say they denied everything. A rumor preserved in abolitionist pamphlets insists the mother spat at her captors, saying, "Better to burn than to bow." Was it truth or invention? Perhaps both. Folklore often preserves what ledgers will not. The newspapers could not print the full story. To admit that an enslaved family had deliberately destroyed a plantation, killed a master, and shaken the parish to its core was too dangerous. Instead, articles used vague words: unfortunate disturbance, tragic accident. The word arson appeared only in northern presses, and even then cautiously. Silence was safer. Erasure was protection. But silence does not erase the act. The fire was real. The plantation burned. The master died. And though their names were omitted, the enslaved family's act carved itself into memory. Imagine that night from their perspective. Imagine the daughter, clutching the clay pot, watching flames leap higher than the columns that had cast shadows over her entire life. Imagine the son, no longer restless but still, staring at a house crumbling into ash. Imagine the mother, scarred and weary, feeling for the first time that chains did not define her. Imagine the father, denied dignity in ledgers, standing for once as something more than property, standing as a man who struck back. That is why the act mattered. Not because it destroyed property, not because it terrified the parish, but because it shattered silence. It said what ledgers could not say, what sermons would not preach, what courts refused to hear, that enslaved people were not passive. They were not voiceless. They were not broken beyond defiance. For one night in 1856, Louisiana burned with their testimony. And though masters tried to erase it, though courts struck their names from records, though newspapers buried their story beneath euphemism, the act survives. It survives in whispers, in folklore, in the very absence of evidence. It survives because fire cannot be fully erased. It leaves scars, blackened beams, soil that smells of ash. And it leaves memory, haunting, unshakable. The night history tried to erase was not just a night of fire. It was a night of truth. The truth that when survival is reduced to silence, silence can become flame. The flames had barely died when vengeance began. In 1856 Louisiana, the destruction of a plantation was not just a crime, it was blasphemy. It tore at the heart of the system itself. For the masters and overseers who gathered at the smoking ruins, there could be no forgiveness, no pause, no justice in any true sense. Only retaliation in blood. By dawn, militia units had been summoned from the parish seat. Armed men rode hard through the night, muskets on their backs, dogs straining against leashes. Survivors from neighboring plantations joined them, fueled by panic and rage. They came not merely to punish the accused family but to stamp out fear itself, to ensure that every enslaved person in the parish understood what would follow defiance. The first to suffer were those closest to the blaze. Men were dragged from their quarters and beaten in the yard, their screams rising with the morning smoke. Overseers forced children to watch, the lesson clear. Resistance meant annihilation. One militia officer's log, half burned but preserved, recorded the chilling words, several Negroes put down as warning. No trial deemed necessary. The phrase put down echoes like a death knell. It suggests execution, killings carried out swiftly, without even the pretense of law. Rumors speak of hangings. Oral accounts collected a century later describe a row of bodies swaying from cypress trees along the bayou road, their silhouettes visible in moonlight. Mothers were forced to walk their children past them, overseers declaring, "This is what happens to fire." Were these accounts exaggerated by memory? Perhaps. But too many voices repeat the same image for it to be dismissed. The accused family, captured within hours, became the center of the spectacle. Shackled, bruised, their faces swollen from beatings, they were paraded through the parish town under armed guard. Crowds gathered, jeering, spitting, hurling stones. To the white population they were not a family. They were symbols of terror, demons dressed in human skin. To the enslaved who watched silently from shadows, they were something else, proof that even the smallest could strike against power. Newspapers later sanitized these parades, calling them necessary displays of order. But abolitionist accounts tell a different story, of a girl no more than 12 walking with her head high despite blood running down her cheek, of a boy refusing to cry though soldiers beat him as they marched, of a mother whispering prayers under her breath, of a father silent, his eyes fixed forward as though already beyond the reach of his captors. The master's funeral, held just days after the blaze, became another performance of vengeance. His coffin, draped in linen, was carried into a rebuilt church guarded by militia. Ministers preached of sin, not the master's but the savagery of those who destroyed him. Scripture was twisted into justification. Servants, obey your masters. The wages of sin is death. Outside, the enslaved were kept under watch, denied entry, their grief and rage locked behind silence. The retaliation did not end with the family. It spread outward like the fire itself. Plantations across the parish imposed new rules. Whippings grew harsher, quotas heavier, surveillance constant. Patrols scoured the roads, suspicious of every movement. Fear of contagion, fear that resistance would spread, drove cruelty to new heights. In one overseer's diary, an entry from October 1856 reads, "All Negroes searched nightly. Gatherings forbidden. Fires watched closely. The parish trembles still." And yet, despite the ferocity of retaliation, the act could not be erased from memory. For every lash given, for every body strung up, the enslaved remembered the blaze. They remembered that for one night, a family had turned silence into fire. Even as they wept, even as they buried their dead, they carried a dangerous knowledge. Power could be broken. The masters knew this too, and it terrified them. That is why their retaliation was so brutal. It was not just punishment. It was fear disguised as strength. They needed to convince themselves that order had been restored, that fire would not return, that silence would hold. But silence is fragile. Every act of cruelty cracked it further. Abolitionist newspapers in the North picked up whispers of the massacre. One 1857 article in the Liberator noted, "We hear reports of a great fire in Louisiana, said to be the work of the enslaved themselves. The planters deny it. The courts erase it. But fire leaves its own testimony." Even far away, the story spread, carried by rumor and resistance, seeping through the cracks of suppression. The aftermath was not just bodies and blood. It was also absence. Records vanish in 1856. Parish rolls skip entries. Families disappear from ledgers. The accused family, once listed in probate as assets, is nowhere to be found after the fire. Not marked dead. Not sold. Simply gone. Their erasure was deliberate, a second punishment meant to wipe them from history. But erasure only testifies to their power. If their act had meant nothing, there would be no need to bury it so thoroughly. For the enslaved who survived, the memory of retaliation was scar tissue. Mothers told children never to mention the fire aloud. Songs that hinted at flame were sung only in whispers. Silence was once again imposed, heavier than before. And yet, silence carries memory like an ember under ash. The aftermath of the Louisiana fire of 1856 was not only punishment. It was revelation. It revealed the fear of masters, the brutality of their vengeance, the fragility of their system. It revealed that a single family could shake the foundations of an empire built on chains. The militia hanged bodies. The courts erased names. The newspapers buried truth. But still the story endured. Because fire leaves marks. On soil. On memory. On history itself. And when we look back now, across 169 years, those marks still burn. By the time the flames were reduced to ash, the trial was already being written, not in search of truth but in service of order. The Louisiana court system in 1856 was never meant to protect the enslaved. It was a stage, a ritual, a theater designed to restore the illusion of control. The family accused of setting fire to the plantation was dragged into this theater, their lives already forfeit, their verdict already signed before they entered the chamber. The courthouse itself stood in the parish seat, a brick building with tall windows and a gavel that rang not with justice but with the echo of property law. Enslaved people were not considered citizens. They could not testify against whites, could not summon witnesses in their defense, could not speak as equals. The trial was not for them. It was for the masters, the planters, the overseers, all of whom needed reassurance that order still reigned. A surviving court fragment, published in a local gazette before vanishing from records, begins, On the charge of inciting arson and destruction of property, the Negro family was presented before the court. Even here their names are absent. They are not individuals. They are the Negro family, erased before their trial even began. Witnesses were called, but only from the congregation of whiteness. Overseers swore they had seen suspicious behavior in the days before the fire. One claimed the boy had been seen near the barn at dusk, carrying what appeared to be ember. Another insisted the mother had grown defiant in recent weeks, speaking boldly when silence was required. These testimonies, filled with bias and fear, were accepted without question. No enslaved voices were heard. No one was permitted to speak on behalf of the accused family, though dozens must have seen their labor, their suffering, their silence. Their perspective was legally inadmissible, truth barred by law, silenced by structure. Confessions appeared in the record, though their authenticity is doubtful. One clerk's notes state, "The accused did admit guilt, claiming act was willed by Providence." Another line insists, "The woman confessed under examination, saying fire was just punishment." But examination was code. In Southern courts, examination often meant torture. Whips, shackles, hunger, even the threat of death for children. What choice did they have but to confess when their bodies were being torn apart? The judges spoke with severity. One declared, "This crime, if left unpunished, shall incite the Negro population across the parish." Another warned, "This fire must not be permitted to spread, neither in flame nor in rumor." The verdict was clear before testimony concluded. Guilty. Sentence, death. The family would be executed not for what they had done, but for what their act represented, a crack in the foundation of slavery itself. Newspapers printed sanitized versions of the trial. Local presses described it as a swift and necessary proceeding, praising the wisdom of the judges. One article claimed the court had extinguished the flame of rebellion. But Northern abolitionist papers carried a different account, gathered from whispers and traveling witnesses. In the Anti-Slavery Bugle, a correspondent wrote, "A family accused of burning their master's estate were condemned in Louisiana. Their trial bore no defense, no counsel, no justice. It was vengeance dressed in law." The most haunting details come from rumor, from margins scribbled by those unsettled even within the system. A diary belonging to a young white woman in the parish notes. They said the girl would not weep. They said she looked the judges in the eye. Some pitied her youth, but no one dared speak. Another militia log adds, "The boy showed no remorse. He stared as if beyond this world." And then, silence. The official trial records vanish in the courthouse fire of 1862. Was it accident or design? The result is the same. The story collapses into fragments, testimonies erased, verdicts reduced to a single phrase in probate books. Negro family executed. The deliberate vagueness was its own form of punishment. Not only were they killed, their names, their words, their humanity were denied even the permanence of ink. But the erasure itself speaks volumes. To suppress so completely is to reveal fear. Fear that the trial, if remembered honestly, would show not justice but brutality. Fear that future generations might see the act for what it was, not savagery but defiance. Fear that others, hearing the truth, might carry the fire forward. The court was meant to silence. But in silencing, it exposed the fragility of the system. If the system were strong, it would not need such erasure. If the act were meaningless, it would not require a trial at all. But they staged it, they condemned, they destroyed the records, all because the boy, the girl, the mother, the father had revealed a truth too dangerous, that even in chains the enslaved could resist. So the trial was less a proceeding and more a performance. A play with roles pre-written, judges as arbiters, witnesses as chorus, the enslaved family as villains. And yet, despite the script, cracks appeared. A girl staring defiantly. A boy refusing to cry. A mother whispering prayers. A father silent, beyond reach. These cracks survive in rumor, in memory, in folklore. They reveal that even at the moment of judgment, the accused refused to play the part written for them. In the words of the court, they were guilty. In the silence of the record, they were erased. But in the whispers that survived, they remain what the court could not bear to admit, a family who struck back. If the fire was the act and the trial the performance, then suppression was the burial. The Louisiana Massacre of 1856 was not only punished with blood, it was erased with ink, or rather, with the deliberate removal of ink. What could not be silenced with whips and nooses was silenced with missing ledgers, softened language, and courthouse fires that conveniently consumed the record. The first stage of suppression came from newspapers. Early reports described a conflagration of notable proportions in St. Landry Parish. The articles acknowledged loss of life considerable, but within a week the wording shifted. The fire became unfortunate accident. The enslaved family, initially mentioned as suspects, vanished from the page altogether. By the third week, the story was reduced to a footnote about property loss, as though the screams of women and children had never filled the night sky. Court records suffered a similar fate. The minutes of the trial should have been preserved in the parish courthouse, alongside deeds and wills. Yet when researchers later combed through the archives, they found gaps. Whole months missing from the docket. The section that should have detailed the trial is gone, consumed in the courthouse fire of 1862. Officially, the blaze was blamed on Union raids during the Civil War. But whispers suggest another possibility, that planters themselves used chaos as cover to destroy files too dangerous to leave behind. Probate ledgers reveal another kind of erasure. In 1854, the enslaved family was listed: woman 34, man 36, girl 12, boy 10. By 1857, those entries are gone. Not crossed out. Not marked as deceased. Simply removed as though they had never existed. To a historian's eye, this absence is louder than any notation. When enslaved people disappeared from ledgers without explanation, it often meant deliberate suppression. The masters wanted no trace of their defiance recorded in perpetuity. Family Bibles, too, carried silences. White planters were meticulous in recording births, marriages, deaths. But in 1856, entries skip. The year vanishes between lines. A wedding in 1855, a baptism in 1857, but nothing of the fire, nothing of the trial, nothing of the massacre. Descendant families interviewed in the 20th century admitted their elders had been told never to mention the year of flame. Silence became inheritance. Even the language of suppression reveals fear. Where newspapers could have written murder or arson, they chose disturbance and incident. Where ledgers could have written death by execution, they chose removed. Where death certificates could have said burned in fire, they wrote instead, cause unclear. Each vague phrase was a shield, protecting the system from acknowledging its own vulnerability. But suppression is never complete. It leaves fingerprints. A burned militia log still carries the words, child executed as example. A diary fragment from a neighboring planter mentions the frightful Sabbath when the Negroes brought fire. An abolitionist paper reprinted rumors of the family's trial, describing it as a farce of law, a vengeance in disguise. These fragments are evidence not only of the act but of the effort to bury it. Suppression also operated in the spoken world. White planters forbade discussion of the fire, warning overseers never to mention it aloud. But the enslaved whispered it in quarters, coded into songs and stories. One refrain, remembered decades later, spoke of fire walking through the cane. Another whispered prayer ended with, "Let the fire speak when we cannot." The very act of suppression ensured that the enslaved carried the memory in secret, a flame kept alive beneath ash. We must also see suppression in its wider pattern. Across the South, whenever enslaved people resisted, records vanished. Poisonings in Louisiana kitchens, rebellions in the Carolinas, even Nat Turner's uprising, all were softened in newspapers, distorted in courts, erased in ledgers. Masters understood that resistance stories were dangerous. To admit them was to admit weakness. To preserve them was to risk inspiring others. And so, history became curated silence. But silence, paradoxically, is proof. If the Louisiana fire of 1856 had been meaningless, there would be no need to bury it so thoroughly. If it had been an accident, the records would remain. It was precisely because it was deliberate, precisely because it terrified, that it was erased. Suppression itself becomes testimony. Think of the courthouse fire of 1862. Was it truly accidental? Or was it the final cleansing, the last chance to wipe away memory before Union troops arrived and freed the enslaved? We cannot know for certain. But the timing, the completeness, the gaps it left behind, all suggest design. What is left to us now are not full accounts, but shadows. Shadows in diaries, in missing census pages, in silence carried through generations. And shadows, though faint, tell their own story. They tell us that something happened in 1856 so profound that the powerful chose erasure over memory. They tell us that the enslaved family's act mattered enough to terrify an entire parish. They tell us that fire does not vanish when it is smothered. It smolders, waiting, whispering. Suppression was meant to bury them. But in burying, it revealed the fear at the heart of slavery. that silence can break, that property can rebel, that ledgers can burn. The families' names may be gone, their voices erased, their bodies consumed. But suppression ensures we know something dangerous existed, something too powerful for the system to admit. And that is why we speak of them now. Because silence is not absence. Silence is evidence. What the newspapers erased, the ledgers omitted, and the courts burned, the people remembered. Memory does not always survive in ink. Sometimes it lives in whispers, in songs sung softly, in warnings passed from grandmother to child. After the fire of 1856, when official history turned its back on the enslaved family who struck with flame, folklore became their monument. In the quarters, stories of the blaze spread quickly. Children were told in hushed tones, "Do not play with fire, fire already walked among us once." Some versions painted the family as martyrs, others as spirits still roaming the cane fields. A refrain hummed during work, collected later by folklorists, carried the chilling line, "The house burned, the master cried, the fire did not lie." These words, disguised as song, ensured the story lived on even as overseers pried ears for forbidden talk. Songs were coded, layered with double meaning. On the surface they sounded like spirituals, laments for suffering, prayers for deliverance. But hidden beneath the lyrics was memory of that night. One verse, remembered decades later, spoke of embers in the pot, carried in the dark. To the masters, it sounded harmless, a hymn of weariness. To the enslaved, it was a reminder of courage, a blueprint of resistance. Grandmothers passed on warnings wrapped in superstition. "Never sit too close to the fire," they told children, "for it may call you to finish what was begun." Others warned against sleeping near church pews, whispering that even God's house could not protect you from chains. These stories preserved more than memory. They carried lessons, shaping the next generation's understanding of slavery not as passive endurance but as constant, hidden war. Descendants interviewed in the early 20th century recalled family sayings tied to the event. One woman remembered her grandmother's words, "There was a night when fire spoke louder than whips. They tried to kill the memory but they couldn't kill the truth." Another recalled being told as a child never to mention the fire to outsiders. "They will punish you for it even now." That fear, that speaking the truth could still bring punishment, is itself evidence of how deep the trauma ran. Folklore often magnified the family into something larger than life. In some stories they escaped execution, fleeing into the swamps where they became legends, living ghosts who struck terror in overseers. In others they died, but their spirits haunted the cane rows, their footsteps heard on humid nights, their whispers in the crackle of burning stalks. These tales blurred the line between fact and myth, but that blurring was survival itself. To speak too plainly was dangerous. To clothe memory in myth kept it alive. Among the enslaved, the fire became both pride and warning. Pride because it proved that even those counted as property could strike back with devastating force. Warning because the retaliation that followed left bodies hanging from trees, families scattered, names erased. Folklore balanced both truths. One song praised the family's courage, another mourned the children who suffered. Together they created a narrative more complex, more human than any court record could capture. Even white families could not entirely suppress the story. Diaries from neighboring plantations mention the night of flame, though often coded with euphemism. One planter's wife wrote, "The Negroes whisper still. Something dreadful happened last summer. They say it began with children." Her discomfort reveals how the story lingered in memory even among those who wanted it gone. Silence may have been law, but memory seeped into corners nonetheless. By the time folklorists began collecting stories from formerly enslaved people in the 1930s, the Louisiana fire still flickered in memory. Interviewees spoke of a family who would not bow, of the night the house burned, of a girl with fire in her hands. Though details shifted, some placing the fire earlier, some later, the core remained constant. Enslaved people resisted, and masters feared that memory so deeply they tried to erase it. Folklore did what archives could not. It preserved not just the fact of resistance but its emotional truth. It carried the fear, the pride, the grief, the rage. It turned absence into presence. Where ledgers show gaps, songs show continuity. Where newspapers show silence, whispers show testimony. This is why folklore matters. Because for centuries, history was written by those with power, planters, judges, clerks, ministers. Their pens erased what threatened them. But the enslaved carried their own history in memory, passed mouth to ear, generation to generation. And though memory bends, though details shift, its persistence is proof. Proof that the fire of 1856 was not an accident. Proof that the family's act was not forgotten. Proof that even when erased from ink, they burned on in story. And even today in parts of Louisiana, descendants still tell pieces of it. Some speak of land where the soil smells of ash. Others mention names half-remembered, family lines that were cut short in fire. These fragments, fragile but stubborn, show that folklore can outlive suppression. It may not provide names or dates, but it carries truth, the kind of truth the system feared most, that resistance was real and that the enslaved were never silent. The family who set fire to the plantation in 1856 may be absent from the archives, but they are present in the songs, in the warnings, in the whispers that refuse to die. And in many ways, that is the stronger monument. For monuments of stone can crumble. Records can burn. But a song carried on lips across generations is harder to kill. They live not in the courthouse, not in the newspapers, not in the ledgers. They live in memory. And memory, even in silence, endures. The Louisiana Massacre of 1856 was not an isolated eruption of madness. It was part of a pattern, a hidden lineage of defiance that stretched across the South, connecting kitchens and cane fields, pulpits and swamps. Masters called these acts accidents or savagery or misfortune. Courts called them crimes. Newspapers called them disturbances. But when you piece the fragments together, a different picture emerges. The enslaved were never passive. They were never silent. And they were never alone. 20 years earlier, in 1836, reports surfaced in Point Capee Parish of enslaved men who slipped poison into the master's coffee. The local press, terrified of panic, called it contamination. But militia notes reveal the truth. Several Negroes executed for administering poison, motive rebellion suspected. The Louisiana fire fits this same mold. An act sanitized in public, brutalized in private, remembered in whispers. Go back further to 1811, the German Coast Uprising, just miles from where the 1856 fire burned. Hundreds of enslaved people marched with cane knives and muskets, burning plantations along the Mississippi River as they advanced toward New Orleans. Officially, the uprising was crushed. Dozens were executed, their heads displayed on pikes. But the memory lingered. Mothers told their children, there was a time when the river burned. The family of 1856 would have grown up in the shadow of that legend. Move east to Virginia, 1831, Nat Turner's Rebellion. A preacher, driven by visions, led men into homes where they killed nearly 60 whites before being captured. Turner was hanged, his body flayed, his name cursed in Southern courts. Yet his defiance traveled. Planters in Louisiana whispered of another Turner whenever crops were burned or barns collapsed in flame. The act of the enslaved family in 1856, though smaller in scale, carried the same symbolic terror, that obedience was not guaranteed, that fire could erupt anywhere. Even the smallest acts fit the pattern. Overseer diaries from South Carolina in the 1840s complain of frequent arsons. One entry notes, Negro boy caught with ember, flogged severely, intent suspected. Another mentions, barn consumed, no explanation found. These were not accidents. They were messages carved in fire, no less deliberate than the Louisiana blaze. Folklore preserved this pattern even when records did not. Songs spoke of the poison in the cup, the barn that burned, the boy who ran. Each line was a breadcrumb, connecting communities across states, across generations. The enslaved family of 1856 was not the first to strike, and they knew it. They carried stories of those who had resisted before, stories that gave them both courage and caution. What terrified the masters most was not the fire itself, but the possibility that it was contagious. If one family could burn a plantation, why not 10? Why not 100? That is why retaliation was so severe, why suppression was so complete. It was not just about punishing one family. It was about sending a message to all others. Silence must remain. Hope must not spread. But hope always spread. The very brutality of suppression ensured it. When bodies were hanged in rows, enslaved children did not see only punishment. They saw proof that someone had dared to fight. When newspapers softened rebellion into disturbance, the enslaved read between the lines, recognizing the truth that whites feared to print. When courthouses burned their records, the absence itself became evidence. Something had happened too powerful to be remembered in ink. The Louisiana fire of 1856 joins this hidden archive. It belongs to the same lineage as the poisonings, the uprisings, the whispered songs. It reminds us that slavery was never unchallenged. Every plantation carried embers. Every field carried memory. Every whip cracked against a body that might one day strike back. We see the same fear echoed in legislation. After Turner's rebellion, Virginia banned teaching enslaved people to read and write. After the German Coast Uprising, Louisiana expanded its patrols and restricted movement. After the 1856 fire, parish records show stricter curfews, harsher punishments, and constant surveillance. Each law was a scar, proof that resistance had been real, proof that it had left the masters shaken. And when we widen the lens even further, the pattern extends beyond America. In the Caribbean, enslaved people burned cane fields from Jamaica to Barbados. In Haiti, the enslaved rose in a revolution that toppled empires. Southern planters feared these examples deeply, calling them contagions. They tried to build walls of silence to keep them out. But memory travels. Stories of Haiti reached Louisiana. Tales of Jamaican fires spread into Carolina. The enslaved listened. They learned. They acted. The enslaved family of 1856, then, was not alone. Their fire was not a singular madness. It was part of a chorus, a hidden, defiant song carried across oceans, across generations. To see them in isolation is to accept the lie of suppression. To place them within the pattern is to see the truth, that slavery was always resisted, always contested, always fragile beneath its own weight. The masters feared the pattern more than any single act, because a single fire could be rebuilt. A single family could be executed. But a pattern? A pattern meant the system itself was cracking. A pattern meant silence was never secure. A pattern meant that even children, armed with embers, could topple mansions built on chains. This is the legacy of the Louisiana Fire of 1856. It was not only a local tragedy. It was a node in a web of resistance stretching from bayou to coast, from Virginia to Haiti, from whispers to revolutions. They were not alone. They never were. The story of the Louisiana Fire of 1856 ends not with ash but with silence. The plantation lay in ruins, its columns toppled, its wealth smoldering. The accused family was executed, their bodies discarded without grave markers, their names scratched from ledgers, their memories scrubbed from newspapers. Officially nothing remained. The courthouse fire of 1862 sealed the erasure, ensuring that their voices, their trial, their final words vanished into smoke. But history does not end where ink is burned. Absence itself testifies. The very gaps in records whisper louder than the words that survive. The missing trial transcripts, the censuses that skip their names, the probate ledgers that leap from 1854 to 1857 without explanation. Each absence is evidence. Evidence of fear. Evidence of suppression. Evidence that something happened so profound it could not be remembered safely. And beyond the archives, the story endured where no erasure could reach, in memory. Folklore carried it, like an ember smoldering beneath ash. Songs hummed in fields told of the house that burned. Grandmothers warned children not to trust fire, for fire remembers. Descendants recalled whispers of a girl carrying embers, of a boy who stared unbroken, of parents who chose flame over silence. Even distorted, even blurred by time, the memory survived. What does it mean that a family erased from ledgers still burns in memory today? It means suppression failed. It means the system that tried to bury them was weaker than it believed. It means that in silence, the enslaved carved a deeper, truer archive than courts or newspapers ever could. And it forces us to confront a larger truth. Slavery was not unchallenged. The Louisiana Fire was not an accident, not madness, not savagery. It was resistance. It was testimony carved in flame. It was a message to masters that their power, however gilded, was never absolute. To call it a crime is to accept the language of the court that killed them. To call it madness is to accept the silence of newspapers that feared truth. But to see it clearly is to see it for what it was. Survival turned into fire, silence turned into voice. And so, when we end this story, we must not say they are gone. Because they are not. They live in the fragments, in the silences, in the folklore that refused to die. They live in the pattern of resistance that stretched across the South and the Caribbean, from poisonings to uprisings, from whispered songs to revolutions. They live because fire leaves marks, not just on wood and stone but on memory. The Louisiana Massacre of 1856 was buried. But it was not gone. It lingers in the soil of St. Landry Parish, where cane still grows, where the air still smells of sugar and smoke. It lingers in the silence of archives, where missing pages tell louder stories than preserved ones. It lingers in the haunting question that still echoes. Was this madness or was this the only way left to survive? And it lingers here now because we are speaking it. Because each time the story is told, each time the silence is broken, the family rises again from the ash. Not as property. Not as criminals. Not as erased entries in ledgers. but as people, a mother, a father, a daughter, a son, who chose to answer centuries of silence with a single night of fire. This is not closure. There can be no closure for stories buried so deliberately, for voices erased so violently. But it is reckoning. It is refusal. Refusal to let erasure win. Refusal to let silence hold. Refusal to let the family vanish completely. And so we end where the fire began, not with destruction but with testimony. A testimony written not in ink but in ash, carried not by courts but by memory, preserved not by ledgers but by song. If your family carries whispers like this, if you've ever seen a name scratched out in a Bible, if you've heard tales of nights never spoken, write them below. Share them. Because every story told is another ember pulled from the ash. Every comment, every voice brings another record back to life. The Louisiana fire of 1856 was buried. But it was not gone. And it never will be.